Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to New Destiny's webinar on its recent report called Out in the Cold. I'm Carol Corden, and I'm Executive Director of New Destiny. New Destiny Housing is a New York City nonprofit focused on ensuring long-term safety and stability for survivors of domestic violence. For almost 18 years, we have provided housing and related services to New York City's low-income survivors. Our focus has been on what happens to families after their domestic violence crisis and after shelter. For the past 7 years, New Destiny has worked with the nonprofit operators of New York City's shelter system to find out where families go when they leave shelter. As the housing resources available to homeless domestic violence survivors have declined, we have seen the number of people leaving with safe, stable housing plummet. Out in the Cold, the report we are focusing on in today's webinar, is the most disturbing report we have seen in the entire time that we've been collecting this data. More domestic violence shelter residents than ever before are leaving without a safe place to go and possibly still at risk of violence. Domestic Violence Awareness Month is the appropriate time to call attention to a situation that is impacting thousands of families in New York City. We can and must do better. This report describes the problem, but also points to some possible approaches for addressing the issue. Before we discuss the report, I want to introduce someone who represents a district and borough where domestic violence is a major issue. We are honored to have with us today New York City Council member Fernando Cabrera, who represents District 14 in the Bronx, a borough that has been heavily impacted by domestic violence. Councilmember Cabrera has been an outspoken leader on the issues of domestic violence, families, and children in both his public and his personal life. We are pleased to have the council member with us today to speak to the implications of New Destiny's Out in the Cold report.
Thank you, Carol. Those were wonderful words, and we really appreciate all of the hard work and effort that you're putting forth. Without you, we wouldn't be where we are today. Ladies and gentlemen, we are finding ourselves in a situation, a grave situation, a critical situation. And I'm here to sound an alarm. And there is no better time than during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Domestic violence is one of the primary causes and driver of homelessness. We have a housing situation that is grave. We have heard of the reports that recently had come out. The data is out, and we must face the reality. And I believe that the first thing that we need to do is to deal with the housing problem. If you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you will remember that security and self-preservation is a very fundamental need of human beings. Imagine placing a child in a situation where he's feeling insecure about not having that sense of security. And this is why we must first focus on housing. And to do that, we must have a system that provides for subsidized housing. I know there are concerns about people abusing the system, but the reality is that right now we're spending tens of thousands of dollars, over $30,000 to house somebody, where we could do it for a lot less if we would just have a system just to subsidize people's housing to be able to move into a place that they could call home. It makes economic sense, it makes emotional sense, it makes family sense. This is really common sense. And children today are often finding themselves in a no-win state of transition. And this is why it's of utmost importance that we come back to this fundamental need that many of these families who have found themselves homeless to be able to find a place of security that they could call home. Also, in order to do that, we need people to be able to have the proper jobs. And This is why we need to create career path for success, to be able to connect those who have been displaced into viable jobs. And that's going to require education as well, to be able to connect people to educational paths that are going to connect them with the right jobs, so they will have a pathway of success. And then when we talk about children, children today are finding themselves struggling as it is. The average student is struggling to graduate from high school. In the minority population, we find only 13% who are college ready. Now imagine a child that is going through that episode in their lives called homelessness. How much more help do they need? And this is why we need to make sure that we continue to have after-school program. We have lost over 50,000 slots. Imagine that, 50,000 slots when it comes to Beacon program, OST program, after-school program, which are vital for the parents to be able to go and work and not worry about the child. At the same time, the child or the children is able to receive the extra educational help that they need. We know the data is very clear that if a student, a child, does not do well by 4th grade, it's very likely that they're going to continue into that path of doing poorly in school. This is why we need early intervention. This is why we need to be able to provide that safety net for our children. It is imperative that at this moment we really pay attention to what the children are going through. Otherwise, we're going to place them in an impossible situation that no children should ever have to experience. Let me recap. Domestic violence leads to family homelessness. It is a major problem. The New Destiny report points out the fact that survivors are being left homeless. We need to address the problem. It is a complex issue. We know that we must do something about housing, workforce development, and the children's welfare. We cannot afford to leave them out in the cold.
New Destiny undertook this study in the wake of the elimination of the Advantage program and all shelter-based subsidies. We wanted to measure the impact that these cuts had on domestic violence, or DV, shelter residents' abilities to find safe housing. We also wanted to learn about the people who were able to find housing in this difficult environment. We looked at indicators like education and work history to see who was able to obtain housing without financial assistance. Lastly, we looked at the only remaining subsidized housing option, New York City Housing Authority Public Housing, or NYCHA Public Housing, to see if this resource could compensate for the reduction in housing subsidies. What we found is that access to permanent housing is more difficult than ever. 80% of emergency shelter residents had no safe place to go, up 6% over the previous year. If you go back to the period before 2004, when NYCHA and Section 8 were readily available to shelter residents, the increase in unsafe exits is closer to 20%. The outcomes for transitional shelters are a little better since residents can stay longer, but the data is still concerning. 76% of transitional shelter residents had no safe place to go, a 25% increase over the past year. So we wanted to know where people go when they left. In the emergency shelter system, 10% were able to find permanent housing. This is mostly other permanent housing, which is private and unregulated, and therefore the conditions are unverifiable. Another 10% were able to access the transitional shelter system, also known as Tier 2. This shelter system offers a longer length of stay in a safe, confidential location. The remaining 80% went to unsafe destinations. The majority of these individuals were referred to the Department of Homeless Services for additional shelter stays, and many went to locations known to their abuser, including doubled up with family and friends. All of these locations are considered unsafe because if a resident had a safe alternative to domestic violence shelter, she wouldn't have been eligible for the shelter placement in the first place. So where do transitional shelter residents go when they leave? 24% are able to obtain permanent housing, yet the other 76% are also leaving for unsafe destinations. One of the challenges with transitional shelters is that although there is a longer length of stay, which allows more people to access permanent housing from this system, is that the longer that residents are staying in transitional shelters, the fewer opportunities there are for emergency shelter residents to enter the Tier 2 system. The length of stay is up 2 months since the Advantage program ended. We wanted to see if those who were able to find housing had anything in common and what barriers those who weren't able to find housing shared. So we looked at the education levels and work experiences of survivors in the shelter. We found that 54% of emergency shelter and 45% of transitional shelter residents had little to no work experience. Due to the abuse, many victims have been kept out of the workforce or have interrupted work histories. But not surprisingly, those with more work experience were more likely to obtain permanent housing. 48% of emergency shelter residents and 30% of Tier 2 shelter residents do not have a high school degree or GED. Again, those with the highest level of educational achievement had the best housing outcomes in both systems. Those are the residents that had at least some college education. In light of these findings, we recommend a housing subsidy be created. The subsidy should be calibrated to the needs of domestic violence survivors, which could bridge the gap between income and rents. The subsidy should include a service component so that those enrolled could get linked to job training and educational resources, which would help survivors overcome the economic consequences of the abuse and achieve self-sufficiency. While our findings clearly demonstrate the need for a housing subsidy, people always ask, what about NYCHA? Isn't there a priority for survivors of domestic violence? So this study examined whether or not NYCHA housing can compensate for the lack of a subsidy for domestic violence survivors. What we found was access to NYCHA's domestic violence priority is extremely limited. 72% of emergency shelter residents do not meet NYCHA's criteria for domestic violence priority, nor do 78% of transitional shelter residents. So why is access to NYCHA so limited? The criteria used to establish priority is not a good indicator of risk. All domestic violence shelter residents are screened for imminent danger and homelessness, yet few can obtain the documents needed. The other issue is that processing time is very long and often takes longer than the length of stay in shelter. So even those who can meet NYCHA's stringent criteria are often unable to link to an apartment before their time in shelter expires. The current criteria relies heavily upon criminal justice documentation from police and courts. Yet many choose shelter instead of calling police out of fear of reprisals from their batterer, such that the current criteria is not aligned with the experiences and needs of shelter residents. Even those who can meet the stringent criteria are not getting placed in large numbers because of the processing time. Only 3% of qualified applicants were placed directly from emergency shelter into NYCHA public housing due to the limited length of stay in shelter and the long processing time. Transitional shelter residents do a little better since they get to stay in shelter longer, but still, only 24% of eligible applicants are placed before they need to exit. In light of this data, New Destiny recommends that NYCHA modify its documentation requirements. After all, in order to get into shelter, domestic violence survivors are screened by trained social service staff who are looking to assess imminent risk of harm and homelessness. If those social service professionals are able to determine a need for long-term safety, why can't NYCHA follow the same criteria when evaluating whether or not someone needs safe permanent housing? In order for such changes to make a difference, NYCHA must also speed up its processing time. If you change the criteria without speeding the processing, no matter how many more survivors are able to qualify, they still won't get placed before their time in shelter runs out. The New York City Family Justice Centers have had some successes in this area, and New Destiny would love to see those successes built upon and expanded.
Thank you, Catherine, for that excellent overview of Out in the Cold. Domestic Violence Awareness Month provides an opportunity both to recognize this critical issue and to rededicate ourselves to addressing it. Its scale is unacceptably large. Over 30% of homeless families in New York City are using shelter because of domestic violence. That's over 14,000 adults and children. Out in the Cold suggests that we can attack this problem and do so in a cost-effective way. It points to housing subsidies that are appropriate to the economic situation of shelter users and to wraparound services that support survivors in their continued healing and movement toward economic security. The study also highlights the need for research on some promising programs like rapid rehousing that have been used to help promote long-term security for domestic violence survivors in other places around the country. We must join together to promote the long-term safety and stability of victims of abuse. Affordable permanent housing linked to services is a proven way of achieving this end. Permanent housing is more cost-effective than shelter, and it is also a far better outcome for adults and children dealing with the aftermath of domestic violence. New Destiny is working to both develop housing for this vulnerable segment of the homeless population, as well as to improve the access domestic violence survivors have to existing resources. We're particularly excited to be opening a new 41-unit rental project that will provide stable, safe housing for domestic violence survivors leaving shelter. I invite you to explore more about all of our activities on our website.